Hi there, and welcome to the Educators Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. Conversations where we stay curious for a little bit longer about the issues, challenges, and opportunities which we are facing in our schools and in our communities. We're going to explore the slow death of reading with Daisy Christodoulou. In the latest Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, otherwise known as PEARLS, England's primary school children ranked 4th globally for reading proficiency, a significant improvement from their previous position of 8th in 2016 and top now in the Western world. At the time of publication, Schools Minister Nick Gibbs said England's success was aided by government reforms, including a focus on phonics, which teaches children to read using sounds, and to teachers putting reading at the heart of everything they do. And other good news, recent data suggests that we are buying more books. But it seems actually we're reading less. And maybe not so good news is that only 34.6% of children and young people aged 8 to 18 in the UK said they enjoyed reading in their free time in 2024. And that's the lowest level since 2005. Meanwhile, A-level English entries in the UK have decreased from 79,000 in 2016 to 64,000 in 2021, while mathematics has become the most popular A-level. I mean, they now have over 100,000 entries in 2024. Not surprisingly, the number of first-degree undergraduates taking English studies in the UK declined by more than 20% since 2012. And finally, in this list of stats, about half of UK adults do not read regularly, and 35% of adults who used to read have stopped. So today we are going to get curious about what's happening to reading and also English literature in the British curriculum, and whether we should be concerned about these trends. And if we are concerned, then what maybe we can do about it. So who better to discuss this pressing issue than Daisy Christodoulou. Daisy is a teacher, a school leader. She's now Director of Education at No More Marking. She's a prominent figure in education, and she's also known for her work on assessment, curriculum reform, and evidence-based teaching practice. She's also authored several influential books: 7 Myths About Education, Making Good Progress, The Future of Assessment for Learning, Teachers versus Tech, and most recently, I Can't Stop Thinking About VAR. So, how is your year shaping up so far, Daisy?
Really good so far. My year's shaping up better than West Ham's year, the team I support. We haven't had a great start to the year, but no, things are good. I work here at No More Marking, and we're in the midst of a couple of big assessments, and we've got some very exciting new features coming this year. So yeah, all good.
How would you describe your current mission in education?
Great question. So as I say, I work for an assessment organisation, No More Marking. We have this very new way of doing assessment called comparative judgment. And so I think probably my mission is to maybe help teachers and schools have a better understanding of assessment data and help them use it in ways that will help their students learn. That's probably what I hope our organisation can achieve.
Yeah, and you've certainly, through that work and through the books that you've written, I think you've provoked a lot of thinking within and across the education community. And actually, I got really curious about this issue about English in the curriculum and reading when I heard you speaking at the HMC conference back in Belfast in October, and I you could just feel the curiosity right across that audience, and that was partly sampled at the end of the talk when you got a lot of questions. And I know for the rest of that conference, and then when I came back to school and I was sharing that presentation with my colleagues, they found it really, really engaging. So thank you for sparking my interest in this topic. So maybe you could just reiterate your main argument that you were putting across in that talk back in October. What's happening to English literature in the curriculum in schools in England?
Sure. Well, in England, as you read out some statistics at the start, and English literature as an A-level subject has been in decline for about 10 or 15 years now. And maths has been rising as an A-level subject for almost exactly the sort of same amount of time. So at that conference you were speaking about, where you were in the audience and I was speaking, I put up that graph, and it's a really striking graph. It's like a cross. The maths line goes from sort of low to high, and the literature line goes from high to low, and they sort of cross over. They crossed over a few years ago. So what that shows is that students at age 16 in England, they used to pick literature A level in in big numbers. They're now not doing that, and lots of them are doing maths. And that was kind of the starting point for my talk, where I made the point that this is part of a wider kind of global and cultural shift away from the humanities and towards maths. And I explored what some of the reasons are for that, if we should be concerned about it, if it's a problem, so on and so forth. And I should say my background here, I am an English literature graduate, and the organisation I work for, the majority of what we do, not all, but the majority of what we do is assessing writing. So I come at this as a lover of literature and believing that literacy obviously is extremely important. But I also think it's interesting to try and think beyond the superficial about this trend. And that's what I hope we'll do today. And I also think what's really important is to notice that whilst I put up that data from England, this is a global trend. So I think one of the things that frustrates me about this is you can get quite a parochial debate where people will sort of, I think, just maybe want to blame Michael Gove and say, well, the reason everyone's not picking literature A level is all because of Michael Gove's school reforms. And that just doesn't work, because this is happening in America, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in sort of from New Zealand and Canada. You can see similar things. Wales and Scotland, you can see some similar trends. So there's lots of countries with very different education policies that are seeing something similar. And I should probably also say it's not just English literature. I think it's the humanities in general are struggling. So I think it's a global trend. We need to look at global kind of causes and solutions if we think they're necessary.
It certainly is a global trend from my experience. I've been working in the international sector for the last 14 years, and if you speaking to my teachers here over the last few months about this issue in our international school here in Oman, there is concern about the concerns that you were raising. I mean, English literature in our curriculum post 16 is struggling to attract the numbers that we think it should. We've got an absolutely fantastic English department. But I guess the more I've been thinking about what you were saying back in there in October, I find it that I'm sort of quite quickly go to a connection between the reduced interest in, if you like, post 16 English literature and language. And there seems to be a connection there, perhaps with reading low down the school. Do you see that connection too?
Definitely. And I think you can see that in the data as well. And again, I think that's a global issue too. So I think there was a bit of consternation in England recently when they released some data. Actually, it was UK-wide data on younger students reading for pleasure. That's declining. But again, you see that in other countries too. What's interesting about UK data, if you break it out by England and Scotland, you see very similar numbers, a similar fall. And England and Scotland have pursued very different educational reforms in the last few years. So I think that's something that tells you maybe this goes beyond education and education systems and education policies and what we do in school. Maybe it's something deeper than that.
I think there seems to be a decline in interest and engagement in reading for pleasure. I mean, we've heard some fantastic data at the start of the podcast about proficiency in reading, that our readers in England certainly have become more proficient over the last decade or so. And we're now fourth best in the world in terms of proficiency, best in the Western world. So, which is great. That's great news. We're buying more books than ever. That seems a global trend, that we're buying more books. But actually, the enjoyment in reading, and I'll repeat that statistic I mentioned at the start, which I think you were alluding to just then, only 34% of children and young people aged 8 to 18 in the UK last year said they enjoyed reading, so barely a third. And that is the lowest level since 2005. The question then that leads me to is, should we actually be concerned about this? Somebody might say, well, okay, the world's changing. That's just the way the world is. So before I invite you to address that question, should we be concerned? I'm going to maybe offer some points which perhaps a bit biased, but I want us to put these on the table in terms of what my research has shown me so far that reading promotes. So apparently, according to research I looked at, reading, number one, it fosters deeper processing of information, which leads to better understanding and critical reflection. Secondly, it can support better critical thinking and problem solving abilities and inferential reasoning, which we're being told by many thought leaders is what we need in this emerging world of AI. There's a sheer joy that you can get from reading a good book. I mean, I read Where the Crawdads Sing recently, I think last summer, and the joy that I experienced from reading that book was immense. Really, just really loved doing it. And to maybe link to that, reading supports our well-being. It calms the mind. It reduces stress levels by up to 60%, according to research by Dr. David Lewis and the Mental Health First Aid England. So, when we're hearing about the mental health issues, maybe there's a way in which reading can support that. And finally, better reading is associated with better academic outcomes right across subjects. And this is probably, I guess, why Nick Gibb was such strongly had sort of would believe that reading was such a strong foundation, and that was essential for unlocking potential and addressing educational inequality. And his concern with improving reading through phonics, I guess, was driven by its proven effectiveness and its positive impact on literary standards, which then helped to reduce educational inequality. So it seems there's some pretty robust evidence that says we should be concerned about this. What do you think, Daisy?
Yes, I agree. I would agree with all of that. And I think in the speech I gave at that HMC conference you were at, I spoke about sort of two sort of virtues of reading, of literacy. I spoke about the sort of the if you like, almost like the moral and the utilitarian. So I think there's a really nice thing about reading, probably some of the things about how it's allows you to probably experience life through someone else's eyes, perhaps can help with empathy. It can maybe also, the mental health things you talked about, that maybe it helps students, calms them and can put you in a better frame of mind and bring joy. And then also all of the sort of utilitarian aspects of it. Reading is an extremely efficient way of communicating information, reading and writing. So podcasts, for example, I love podcasts. We're doing a podcast here. They're not as efficient a way of communicating information. You can read much quicker. Even slow readers will read much quicker than they can listen, and you can't sort of flick back in the same way that you can with a book, with print. And I think the other thing about reading, the utilitarian aspect, is it's an extension. Reading and writing literacy are an extension. It gives you the ability to extend thoughts in a way that's very, very hard to do. And if you look at pre-literate cultures often, there's a limit to sort of how much they can communicate and how much they can extend thoughts because of the absence of that. So I think that for all those reasons, reading is really important. If I put the sort of the counter argument, which I don't think I do agree with, but how would people push back? I suppose people will push back and say that media has always changed, modes of communication have always shifted, and maybe that's just life. People complained when the printing press arrived. People complained when everybody started reading books. Socrates complained about writing being invented. So you can go back, and people are always complaining about the media shifting. That would be one point. I don't think I do agree with that, but you put it out there. A slightly more nuanced argument, the counter argument. People might say, well, reading is always going to be useful. The utilitarian aspects are always going to be there. But reading for pleasure, is that so important? People might say that. They might say, does it matter that people get their pleasure now, their entertainment in other ways? So, the great age of sort of mass literacy, maybe the late 19th century, early 20th century, all those cheap Penguin paperbacks. People now, the average person likes to watch Netflix, not read a paperback. Is that so terrible? I think there is an issue if we lose reading for pleasure, that we probably do lose something, and that probably the shift to communication in other ways, particularly video, is probably going to change our habits of thought. And I think the person who's written best about this is Neil Postman. His work's really coming back into vogue now. He's a media theorist, and he wrote, I think, a very prophetic, prescient book in the 1980s. And it's remarkable it was written then, because lots of it feels like you could be describing social media, and obviously social media didn't exist then. But he talks all about how changes in the mode of communication actually change the way you think, and they change the kind of thoughts that can be communicated. So he takes a very Marshall McLuhan approach to it. The medium is the message. So I think I'd probably agree with him that if you're moving away from a sort of literate culture where reading is and words are the dominant method of communication to one that's more image and video based, that probably does do something to the way people think, and it probably isn't a good thing.
Is there a similar comparison with exercise? Maybe that we know exercise is good for us. We know what to do, but a lot of us struggle to get the exercise we need. And even though once we're doing it, or once we've done it, we actually really enjoy doing a bit of exercise. Or a lot of us might. Do you think there's a parallel there, that it's like it's good for us, and we know it's good for us, but we just need a bit of a nudge, or we need a bit of encouragement to do what's good for us and not to do what's easier?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good analogy, but it's also a bit of a pessimistic analogy, because you've got a whole history of trying to make interventions in getting people to sort of change their lifestyle when it comes to exercise and diet, that ultimately are not that successful at scale. So most people don't tend to sort of change their habits in that way. And I think, as I say, why I think this is a real challenge is, in the last few years, I've heard so many friends say sort of similar things to you, perhaps, about how they struggle more to get into books now, that they find themselves getting distracted by social media. They find themselves getting distracted by the kind of range of other things that are out there, the constant devices that are buzzing. And friends of mine who are, were big readers, are saying they're finding it more and more difficult to carve out time for reading and to concentrate on a book. And I guess why that worries me is, if people like that are saying they're struggling, how much harder is it going to be for students who are maybe not great readers to begin with? So that's why I say I feel like we are battling a sort of society-wide sort of trend here, and it's not going to be easy. And as I say, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but what I was saying in that speech that I gave in Belfast to you and the group of heads was that, in a sense, perhaps the golden day of reading for pleasure may be over. The days when people really did just turn to it as a leisure option, that may be gone, because there are so many other forms of leisure and entertainment which probably can just grab your attention, and in that initial moment are just a bit more compelling to people. So, as I say, I'm not necessarily happy about that, but it may just be the way the world's going.
Okay, and perhaps the challenge lies in balancing the benefits of the multiple mediums that you can now access. I mean, you can learn a lot and get a lot of enjoyment from listening to a podcast, or watching a Netflix series. That doesn't mean then you necessarily have to ditch the reading as well. And maybe like with a lot of things in the world, it's actually trying to find the balance of the traditional with the modern. We've explored some data. We've certainly, you and I, Daisy, I think we agree that we have a real concern about these trends in the, like, what we might call dramatically the slow death of reading, which is leading to a slow death in the study of English literature and other humanities subjects, certainly post 16. So let's try and be a bit optimistic now. What might we do to actually get more young people in particular back into the reading habit, and maybe getting that balance, which we referenced towards the end of the last section, where, yeah, they can enjoy Netflix, they can enjoy podcasts, they can enjoy music, whatever, but they can also enjoy reading. So what might we do?
One thing that I think was implicit in our discussion in the first half, but maybe I didn't sort of draw out as much as I should have, was that I think a lot of the reasons why reading's in decline is to do with the rise of social media and smartphones, which are very attention grabbing, very compelling, give you these very sort of quick dopamine bursts of dopamine when you sort of log on and find something you like, and constantly new, novel, changing all the time. I think, and that's that. If that is the reason, if that is the reason why people are not reading as much, that would explain why it's a global issue as well. And so if that is the reason, and there's there's some evidence for that. There's other people who would say some of the stuff about smartphones is sort of overblown. But let's say smartphones are a factor in the decline of reading, and particularly in perhaps young students not reading for pleasure because they have other options that are more entertaining. Then I do think I see what you're saying about obviously they can enjoy Netflix, they can enjoy podcasts, they can enjoy music. But I do think all of those things are kind of promoting sort of different habits of thought and concentration to reading. And I think the biggest thing schools can do if they want to promote reading for pleasure is to try and carve out some dedicated, quiet time where I actually don't think it's just the students reading them set to themselves, but actually where the teacher can be reading aloud and there can be a class read aloud. I actually think it's relatively simple. It's very low tech. It's not particularly glamorous, but I think a teacher reading aloud to a class, reading a really nice class reader together, and following it through. So across a period of time, they'll read the whole book together. I think that's really powerful. I think it's really
Yeah.
powerful, and it will mean that all students get the experience of reading a book from start to finish, which I think for many of them, without that, they're not going to do.
Speaking to some of my colleagues in our primary section just the last week, I mean, they were telling me how excited some of the younger children were, where they were going to start reading their first proper book with their teacher. The excitement of a proper book, and they're going to read that together. I mean, do you think that's still happening a lot in primary schools in England or in the UK, or is that something that's starting to phase out of the curriculum?
So yeah, I think there is still quite a lot of it. I remember when I started teaching, there was almost a feeling that reading a class novel, it was almost sort of cheating. That it was, I was sort of started teaching at the height of the sort of 17-part lesson plan. And if you just wrote on your lesson plan, we're going to read a couple of chapters of Holes, it would seem like, well, where's the starter? Where's the plenary? Where's the active transition? And so, and in some ways, I guess as you're a maths teacher, you probably do look at that and probably think, well, that is cheating. You're just reading a nice book together. So I think sometimes I say it can be seen as, is that really a lesson? But I think it is. I think students are going to struggle to read a book from start to finish in any other way. And this is a great way of getting them to do it. So I think it's probably seen as just being a bit too simple and a bit too basic. Like we could be doing so much more with this time. But actually I think no, I'm not sure sometimes that we could be doing more with that time. I think
Yeah.
it's a really valuable use of time.
I did English literature A level, and so as a student, I was studying English literature A level. But I can also recall and know of instances where not only very young children in the primary school get excited about reading a book, but children, let's say in year 7 or year 8 or year 9, get huge pleasure from reading a class novel. And then as a student, as an A level student, and again, it depends partly on the teacher and how they use it. But I remember our English teacher when I was 18, and we were reading with him Middlemarch by George Eliot. And he was getting so excited by certain passages in
Yeah.
Middlemarch, and that enthusiasm. That just, I mean, I would have never read Middlemarch. I mean, for those who don't know Middlemarch, I mean, it's like a brick.
Yeah.
It's a
It
really
is,
long novel.
yeah.
But because we were
Um,
reading sections of that together, and we were actually doing extra reading sessions after school to get through it on a Friday afternoon, and then he'd make sure that we would then read about, I don't know, another 5 chapters before the next lesson. But because we were reading that together and that joint experience, and his enthusiasm and him encouraging us to see and understand what was going on in this amazing novel. I mean, without him reading with him, I would have never got that joy out of reading Middlemarch. I would have probably never touched Middlemarch. So I don't think it matters whether you're a 5-year-old or an 18-year-old or even an adult. I mean, lots of adults get lots of joy in book clubs, don't they, about reading, that shared reading experience. So it's like, say, making sure that we've got that in the curriculum, as well as the sort of proficient, technical skills that we're trying to teach children. Giving the space in the curriculum for reading isn't cheating at all. I mean, it can be a really enriching experience, and that's one of the ways you can role model the joy that we can get from reading. So coming back to the social media thing, so I think we're probably all starting to hear about, aware of what's going to happen in Australia. I think over the next 12 months they're going to, I think, ban social media until kids are 16. That's my understanding. Jonathan Haidt, author of The Anxious Generation, his work's getting a lot of traction globally. I mean, he's actually identified what he calls 4 norms. And he says no smartphones under 14. That's norm number 1. No social media till age 16, number 2. Mobile phone free schools, number 3. And a greater focus on play and independence and responsibility for young people, number 4. So let's say we managed to get all those in place, and that's quite a challenge. But let's say we've got all those in place in a school or in a community. What more beyond that do you think we would have to do? I mean, would that be enough to get the reading habit back, or what more might we need to do?
Yes, I think it will make a difference. And what I think is happening here is what's happening is you've got a shift in civil society happening and a shift in legislation as well. And I think you can see in all kinds of sort of social movements, the law can't get too far ahead of civil society, and civil society can't get too far ahead of the law. If someone had said 10 years ago, let's ban phones in schools, I just think people, schools, parents, teachers, kids wouldn't have worn it. It would have been much harder to do. I think now there's much more of a recognition that there is an issue, and you've got actually some parents coming together and banding together and coming up with groups of parents to try and enforce things like this. You've got more and more parents in schools talking about dumb phones or brick phones. So, as I say, I don't think this is just a sort of government legal issue. It's a bit top down, there's a bit bottom up. And there are things that are coming together. And I think what will happen is, as a society, we are going to shift our attitudes to phones. And I suspect we will look back on some aspects of the last 10 years of the way a lot of students were getting untrammeled access to smartphones and the internet when they were 11 or 12. I suspect that's one of those things we're going to look back at and go, what were we thinking? So I think we're heading for a bit of a new settlement with technology, teenagers. I actually think potentially a new settlement with technology, smartphones, social media, maybe across all of society. And I'm not sure that any of us quite know what that's going to look like exactly, how it's going to shake out. I think if we could get to a point where students are not using phones in schools, that would be huge. But I know from talking to teachers in schools where that's the case, that they'll say often it works really well in school, but the students are still going home and maybe literally spending 6-7 hours of their time on phones outside the school. And I think that has implications for their ability to concentrate, their ability to sort of socialize, communicate, even in school. So I think with all of this, we've got to remember that the time a student spends in school is when you look at it as a percentage of their entire, childhood life, it's actually quite a small fraction. It's not insignificant, but it's nothing like a majority. So I think if we got to those 4 norms Haidt talks about, that would make a big difference. I think, as I say, we are heading for somewhat of a new settlement. I suppose what I am sort of struggling to see is, even with everything I'm saying about a new settlement, what have you, it still feels to me like maybe video and the image are going to be the sort of dominant methods of communication. And it feels hard to see a world where just broadly outside school, people are going back to getting most of their information through sort of reading long form pieces. So that feels like the societal trend that maybe I don't necessarily see unraveling, but who knows?
Quite some time ago, I used to work for an organization called SSAT, and the chairman of SSAT was somebody called Sir Cyril Taylor. And Sir Cyril Taylor was passionate about literacy and reading. And I had the joy of going into a number of schools with Sir Cyril, both in the UK and also in the States. And within pretty much 5 minutes of walking into any school, he had a question that he would always ask. And the question would be, how many books have you got in your library? And at the time, I thought, oh, that's an interesting angle to take. And he was absolutely adamant that there was a connection between a sort of vibrant, well-stocked, well-run library in a school, and then the reading interest of those students within that school. And I guess that was probably taken back good 15 years. But then now I'm the head of an international school here in Oman. And I did some research, but I was thinking about this a couple of years ago. And ideally, if you look at sort of librarian benchmarking, the sort of figures quoted are that a school library should have between 12 and 20 books per child in the school. And so then when I did some analysis, we've got two libraries. We've got a library for our primary school and a library for our senior school. We're a 3 to 18 school. We've actually got 35 books per child across our school libraries, which I'm really pleased about. And we have library lessons, even in Key Stage 3. We have dedicated lessons every week where the kids go into the library and they are supported by the librarian to read. Now, you've got schools like us who are doing that and are very fortunate in a position to do that. I also hear of other schools, like new schools, being set up and they don't even have a library because they sort of take this argument, well, that's old stuff. We don't need books anymore. How important do you think school libraries are, Daisy, in promoting reading in this digital age?
So I think this is a tricky one because I do think libraries are important, and I wouldn't like to see a school without one. So yeah, if I hear of a new school being set up without one, I would feel quite uneasy about that. And I think the existence of a quiet place to read with lots of books is really important in promoting a culture of reading and obviously giving people access to books. But to go back to your question, you know, that original question from Cyril Taylor, how many books have you got in your library? I think I have to feel that libraries are necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. And so it's probably, to go back to our sort of diet and exercise example, that you can have a supermarket full of super healthy food, but if there's a chicken shop around the corner, are your kids going to go to the supermarket? So the issue is not necessarily the existence or otherwise of the supermarket with healthy food. The issue is the chicken shop around the corner. So maybe that's been a little bit unfair. Look, very much, of course, you want libraries and nice places to read and places that students want to go and sit there and read. But I just feel that on its own, that's not going to be enough, and we have to accompany it now with more of this promotion of the habits of reading and the ability to concentrate, and the what you were talking about with your Middlemarch example of teachers reading with students to make sure they you know can get through whole books together.
We've explored some of the trends, we've explored some of the solutions or maybe measures we can take to re-engage more of our students in a reading habit. 6th of March is World Book Day, I think, in the UK, and I think it's 23rd of April globally. So 6th of March, World Book Day. What could we do in our schools on World Book Day, whether it's in March or April? What could we do in the short term to encourage more of our young people to engage in reading for pleasure? What are your thoughts on that, Daisy?
So on the World Book Day issue, I don't want to come across as a Grinch, but obviously one of the things that's happened with World Book Day is it's seen as an opportunity for there to be own clothes day and come in and dress up as your favorite book character, and sort of a bunch of maybe fun activities about characters in books. And again, this makes me sound like maybe a bit of a monster saying this. All those things are lovely in and of themselves. I am not sure how much they are going to promote reading, and I'm not sure how much they're going to address some of the trends that we've talked about. So I don't necessarily have a problem with them in and of themselves. I'm just not sure they're going to do what's claimed for them. And I think the really central point here, I mentioned Neil Postman's book earlier. I'm going to mention it again because it is really important. I think for anyone who's interested in these issues, they should read it. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he is talking about the shift from a word and a text-based culture to an image-based culture. And I think when I was teaching, I used to see World Book Day as being very emblematic of that. Because as much as it was meant to be about books, you realize that a lot of the books that students were engaging with, it wasn't necessarily the book that they were engaging with, it was the TV or film adaptation. That World Book Day turned into something where it was about dressing up as the character. So it was all of these things, as I said, which are not in and of themselves bad things, but I think if Neil Postman, who's this media theorist, was sort of critiquing them, he would say this is just a brilliant example of how the world of image and video has triumphed over the world of text and the book. That even a day dedicated to the book has just been kind of completely colonized by the image and the video. Now, I said at the start that there may be reasons why you think that that isn't necessarily such a bad thing, but I think the way that World Book Day operates at the moment, I'm not sure it is going to be the thing that is going to promote the kinds of extended reading for pleasure that we want. So again, to go back, what would be my sort of main prescription is, can we set aside half an hour or an hour of World Book Day for everybody to read a book together, for a class teacher to read that? And I've seen that happen in schools, that on World Book Day, the whole school, at the end of the day, for half an hour, a teacher will read a chapter from a book, and they will have that experience together. So for me, that's the answer. More of the class reading, and more of trying to read books from start to finish as well, not just maybe the odd chapter or a short extract. I think one issue in England particularly as well is because the exams feature a short extract, there's a lot of work on extracts. But actually that experience of over a few weeks or a couple of months reading something from start to finish, I think is really powerful.
So perhaps we like we've been doing in this podcast, you remind ourselves how important developing a love for reading is. And then I think your challenge, what you're really saying is, consider activities that encourage students to engage deeply with literature, while perhaps having some fun at the same time. Have you got a favorite activity that you'd like to suggest if you were head of a school, or if you were head of English?
Suppose a poem I love teaching, and it is very short. So in terms of promoting the kind of habits of concentration, it's not something you'd read over a couple of weeks or months, but it is short, but it's something you can reread a couple of times, and it helps students understand that rereading is something that you can get value from something. So a poem I always loved teaching and felt was a great sort of introduction to thinking carefully and closely about text is Alfred Tennyson's The Eagle. And what I loved about it is you could do it with very, very young students who were not strong readers, and you could do it with A-level classes. You know, it has the depth to sustain that. It's only 6 lines long, two really short verses, and it's brilliant because younger kids love stuff with animals and the eagle kind of soaring across the sky and a bird of prey. So a lot of younger students would love that aspect of it. And then with older students, you could start talking about nature red in tooth and claw and Darwinism and the Victorian attitudes to religion, and it would sustain all of that. So it's a lovely poem. It's only 6 lines long. I guess it's not a book, so for World Book Day, but it's a lovely poem, and that was always one of my favorite kind of one-off activities to do.
Yeah, it's not a book, but I guess that's an interesting question then. But is maybe poetry a way into engaging with literature, because it is obviously a much shorter form usually, and something which we're planning to do this year for World Book Day is to encourage staff and students to learn a poem by heart and then perform that poem in front of an audience. I think that for me starts to meet that test about encouraging students to engage deeply in literature, whether it's a book or a poem. Maybe poetry is a way into that world.
Definitely, and I felt that when I was teaching, that it is because you get over the length barrier. It is a way that you can have a sort of quicker way in. And so it has to be the start of something. It can't be the only thing, but it is something where you can read a whole text very quickly in a lesson, and it's promoting a kind of concentration in another way, the concentration of rereading and thinking and trying to get some deeper meanings and realizing that the surface meanings are not the only ones. So I definitely think poetry can be a really good way in, and I think memorization of poetry, absolutely really good. And again, I think there's that real sense of achievement, that it can be quite hard to memorize a poem, even a short one, but there is a real sense of achievement when students do it. And I think memorizing it, again, it's something that gives them, in a world where it's so easy to just keep flicking on to the next thing and flicking through to the next thing, the ability to stay with one thing and to realize that there are deeper meanings you can get from it, that's something which I think memorizing poetry can do. So I think there's real value in that, absolutely.
Okay, we're going to go to the final section now, Daisy, and we call it the bottom line it round. So if you're not familiar with the podcast and you're out there listening, wondering what the bottom line it round is, if you've got somebody in your team or somebody you work with who you ask them a question, they go on and on and on and on, then you can ask them to bottom line it when you want a concise and short answer. And that's what we do in the bottom line it round. We're looking for concise and to the point answers. One word's okay, no more than one sentence. That's your limit. We've got 5 questions. Are you ready, Daisy, for the bottom line it round?
Go for it.
Great stuff. Okay, question 1. The biggest leadership lesson that you keep on having to learn?
I think communication. It's a bit of a cliche. You can't. It's not possible to over communicate. So communicate lots.
Number 2, key moment in your leadership journey that made you think or lead differently.
I ran a lot of writing moderation sessions, and they changed the way I think about moderating writing. So now I do it very differently, and also about the challenges of just communicating consistently and making sure everyone takes away what you meant. So writing moderation has really changed. Running writing moderation really changed my career.
Okay, so what's your favorite way to unwind at the end of a busy day working for No More Marking?
Well, this is where I say I read a book, right? So I do still just about enjoy reading. So my favorite sort of reading for pleasure is still Agatha Christie. So I do love rereading and Agatha Christie. That would be a way to unwind. I also enjoy watching football. I'm a West Ham fan. We spoke about that. So I enjoy going to watch a match. So those will probably be my 2 things. Yeah.
Question 4. Leadership is?
I'm going to say communication again. I think that is such an important part of it, of clear communication.
Clear communication. And finally, the purpose of education should be to?
Hand on the soul of civilization to the next generation. And I think that's a quote from G.K. Chesterton. I think. So I've pinched that. Great
quote, and very apt. Okay, well, thanks, Daisy, for joining us on the Educators Corner podcast today. You've certainly, I think, maintained your reputation for making us think about education, about reading, about literature. We've had a great conversation, and I just want to thank you on behalf of the education community globally. I mean, I'm not sure you're aware of the impact you have, but you really make us think about what we are doing in our classrooms, in our schools with our young people. So thank you for the contributions that you continue to make to pushing forward really provocative thoughts and thinking about making education even better. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kai. I appreciate that.
You've been listening to the Educators Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. The podcast where we stay curious for just a little bit longer. The Educators Corner podcast is hosted by me, Kai Vasher, and produced by Stuart Pardoe, Zoe Snell, and Marion James, and by BSM BSS Productions.